Tonight we step into an age where teacups weren't just porcelain accessories, they were status symbols, silent judges, and, if you can believe it, meticulously regulated in actual printed manuals. You're seated now, sort of upright, corset biting a little, on a tufted Victorian settee. The room smells faintly of lavender polish and boiled cabbage, and the hostess is smiling with all the warmth of a tax audit. The teacup in your trembling hands is absurdly small, so small, in fact, that you're certain one bad inhale will slurp the whole thing. And heaven help you if you sip too fast, or too slow, or too loudly. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just sat down in an Edwardian parlor. It's 1907. The world outside might be changing, automobiles are honking their way into city life, and suffragettes are making headlines, but here, in this drawing room, it's still 1883. The air is thick with jasmine sachets and the pressure of getting the tea just right. And here's where it begins, the teacup. Not the tea, not the saucer, not even the teaspoon. It's the cup that decides your fate. You hold one now, feeling the delicate, translucent rim graze your lips. It's barely larger than a shot glass. Which is ironic, because if you drink too much at once, you're essentially doing Edwardian shots. The hostess eyes you. Not with malice, but with expectation. Because in this world, women are expected to know. They are trained, quietly and thoroughly, in the unspoken art of domestic presentation. The right hem length. The right volume of idle conversation. And yes, the correct size of a teacup for every time of day and every tier of guest. It's a hierarchy in porcelain. Now here's a mainstream historical fact for you. During the Edwardian era, 1901 to 1910, domestic rituals were more strictly codified than we remember today, especially for middle and upper class women. Afternoon tea wasn't just a snack, it was a mini theater performance in social grace. The hostess was the director, and every object, from the teacup to the sugar tongs, was a prop with a cue. But here's the quirky twist, teacup sizes were not standardized. Not by any modern measurement. Instead, there were guides, sometimes handwritten, sometimes printed by etiquette schools or homemaker clubs, that specified different teacup sizes for different occasions. A breakfast cup might be nearly twice the volume of a dainty afternoon cup, and woe betide the woman who used the wrong one. Imagine waking up to make tea for your husband's cousin, and realizing, too late, you've used a supper cup before noon. Scandalous. Potentially marriage-ending. Historians still argue whether these guides were universally followed, or more aspirational than practical, like buying a Peloton to hang laundry on. But what's agreed upon is this: the pressure was real. Manuals existed. Women read them. And some went to great lengths to obey. You glance back down at your cup. It looks like something made for a doll. The saucer is so small, it could double as a coaster for modern espresso. But your hostess insists it's the only acceptable vessel for an introductory acquaintance tea. And now you start to notice things. Her own cup is slightly larger. Subtly. Like, maybe half a thimble more in diameter. But it is bigger. Her tea is stronger, too. That's not by accident. You're being sized. In Edwardian society, cup size equals intimacy. A small cup said you are new here. Welcome, but cautiously. A larger cup said we've moved past pleasantries. Let's gossip. And the largest, often reserved for family or scandalously bold friendships, meant I trust you. Or I at least trust you not to judge me for using condensed milk. There were even cups used exclusively for serving clergymen. Tall, narrow ones, to avoid puddling the tea and to preserve heat for longer scripture chats. Some women kept them boxed and labeled, like holy relics. It's absurd, but it's also kind of genius. A secret language made of china. You shift in your chair, trying not to slosh. The tea is weak, almost offensively pale, and the sip you take barely wets your mouth. But you nod and smile, because that's what's expected. This is an introductory pour. Meant to be light, barely sweet, a signal of measured curiosity. The hostess is watching how you hold the handle. If your pinky's out, she'll assume you've read some etiquette, but if your grip is too stiff, she might mark you as nouveau riche. And here's your first joke of the night. If you accidentally sip from the saucer instead of the cup, the ghost of Emily Post appears and revokes your bank credit. Now you notice the other guests. 3 women, all wearing frothy hats that could double as centerpieces. They each have cups slightly larger than yours. They giggle into them, like conspirators. You wonder how long it took them to graduate to their size. Is it earned through gossip? Donations to church raffles? Proper hat pin usage? One woman taps her spoon twice on the rim. That, apparently, signals she'd like more sugar. Not verbally, of course, that would be crass. You follow suit, but the hostess doesn't respond. You've asked too soon. Sugar must be requested after the 3rd sip, not before. That's the unspoken rule. You feel yourself shrink into your doily-trimmed chair. There is something hypnotic about this domestic theater. On the surface, it's all lace and lemon biscuits, but underneath, it's a psychological war of manners. The kind that doesn't get written into history books because no one bled unless you count the slow leak of dignity when your cup is judged common. A fringe pamphlet from 1908 actually featured a size chart for teacups based on womanly virtues. It was anonymous and possibly a parody, but some scholars think it circulated seriously among certain tea circles. It included things like thrift equals 4 ounces capacity, modesty equals 3.5 ounces, and vulgar appetite equals 6 ounces or more. Imagine being called vulgar, because you're just thirsty. You glance again at your cup. You swear it's shrinking. Or maybe your self-esteem is. Either way, you're starting to get the sense that in this world, silence isn't passive, it's policed. And porcelain? It's the tool of the trade. You ease back slightly in your chair, trying to appear poised while your brain is still processing what just happened. A sugar faux pas. A silently judged cup. You'd laugh if it weren't so strangely intimidating. That dainty teacup now feels heavier than it should. Not physically, porcelain doesn't weigh much, but socially. Symbolically. Like you're holding a miniature test of your entire character. And then, the hostess does something unexpected. She reaches under the tea table, rustles through a box, and produces a booklet. Creamy paper, embossed edge, the kind of thing you'd expect to see tucked in an heirloom Bible. She lays it delicately beside you, almost conspiratorially, and murmurs, for your reference. You glance down. It's an instruction manual. 4 teacup sizes. You blink. Once. Twice. And then realize this is not a joke. There, in formal script, is the title, Guidelines for the Appropriate Presentation of Tea and Associated China Within the Home. Published in 1904 by the Ladies' Improvement Circle of Surrey. You flip to the first page, and your jaw slackens. There's a full chart illustrated outlining recommended teacup volumes by time of day, event type, and guest relationship. Morning callers, 5.5 ounces. Afternoon friends, 4 ounces. Strangers met at church, 3.75. Widowed uncles, very specific, get 4.25, but only if they bring flowers. And yes, the booklet contains actual diagrams. Tiny sketches of teacups next to rulers, arrows pointing to optimal lip flare and handle curve. One diagram even features a teacup with a red X through it, captioned too bold. You're pretty sure that one's shaped like a goblet. Mainstream history tells us the Edwardian era was an age of refinement, but this is Olympic-level micromanagement of hospitality. You turn the page, and it gets even more niche, a paragraph on acceptable saucer depths for women of various dispositions. Deep saucers, apparently, suggest emotional extravagance. You can't make this up. Or, rather, someone did. Historians still argue whether manuals like this were fully serious or veiled satire. Some think they were written by etiquette obsessives, others suspect clever housewives crafted them to poke fun at the growing domestic rigidity of their age. A few scholars even believe they began as party jokes, Victorian Mad Libs, but were later adopted in earnest by women desperate for rules in an increasingly unstable world. And that's something easy to forget. The Edwardian period was a transitional time. Electricity was creeping in. Women were starting to question corsets and voteless futures. But inside the home, order reigned. The manuals gave women something concrete to follow. In a world that didn't offer them much freedom, at least they could be correct. You flip to another section, the guest cup hierarchy. A visual ranking system of teacups, from curiosity callers to lifelong confidants. Each one hand-drawn with shaded rims, like sacred artifacts. Apparently, the tiniest cup, 2.75 ounces, was only used in cases of social obligation without reciprocal warmth. Cold, right? Literally and figuratively. You're essentially saying, here's your tea, please leave. The next page features a cautionary tale. A short story about a fictional hostess, Mrs. Agatha P., who once served a large breakfast-style cup to a recent acquaintance. The horror. The pamphlet describes the fallout like it's a Greek tragedy. The guest assumed closeness, visited too often, spread rumors, and ruined Mrs. P.'s bridge group. All from a 6-ounce pour. That's your second joke of the night. In Edwardian society, you could end a friendship with the wrong teacup, but divorcing your husband still required acts of parliament. But perhaps the most eyebrow-raising section of all? Teacup sins. Yes, sins. There are 7, of course. They include 1. Overpouring. 2. Mixing cup styles at one table. 3. Presenting unmatched saucers. 4. Using chipped china, unless in mourning. 5. Stirring counterclockwise. 6. Passing the cup before the milk. 7. Offering a cup of 5+ ounce before 2 p.m. You almost want to applaud. Not for the rules, but for the sheer, audacious creativity. Who thinks like this? And more importantly, how did these ideas get taken seriously? One fringe theory, proposed by a retired librarian/armchair sociologist, suggests that women used these manuals as a covert means of power. If society won't give you a career, autonomy, or legal standing, make them fear your tea table. Use porcelain precision as a form of quiet dominance. Build an empire out of bone china and serve it with a smile. You run your fingers along the edge of the booklet. The paper is worn in that way that only repeated use creates. This wasn't decoration. It was used. Studied. Annotated, even. There's a faded pencil note in the margin. Never again for Mrs. H, 3.5 ounces next time. You can't help but wonder who Mrs. H was, and what she did to deserve demotion. And this is the beauty of it, the strange beauty, anyway. These manuals weren't just lists. They were diaries. Social maps. Emotional scorecards disguised as hostess advice. Women didn't need Excel spreadsheets. They had cup sizes. Now, the hostess is watching you again. You gently place the booklet back on the table. She nods. There's an odd sort of approval in her eyes, like you've passed a test without knowing it was happening. She refills your cup, still small, but maybe just slightly fuller this time. A promotion. You sip, careful not to clink. There's a ritualistic comfort to it, isn't there? As ridiculous as the rules seem, they offer certainty. And in a world where most women's worth was measured by how well they served others, maybe mastering the tea ritual gave them something of their own. A space where they made the rules, even if those rules involved exactly 4 ounces of Darjeeling, served clockwise, no lemon unless outdoors. As you settle into the routine, you can almost understand the appeal. You, too, might start keeping notes. Hosting is exhausting, but scoring it like a chess match? Now that's empowering. You lean forward ever so slightly, letting your eyes drift around the room. There's a calming symmetry to it, frilly curtains perfectly tied back, furniture arranged for conversation but not intimacy, and a tea service that looks like it was curated by a porcelain-obsessed deity. It's all perfectly calibrated, and the teacup you now cradle in your hand, a slightly larger one than before, is more than just a vessel. It's your scorecard. You're climbing the ranks. You're beginning to understand. In Edwardian England, especially among the middle and upper classes, domesticity was its own quiet power structure. And the housewife? She was the high priestess. Her altar, the drawing room. Her sacraments, tea, cakes, and very, very precise hosting. A mainstream historical fact here: Edwardian society placed enormous value on the idea of the ideal homemaker. This was the age of Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, a domestic Bible that told women how to clean, cook, parent, manage servants, treat minor illnesses, and yes, host tea. Being a good housewife wasn't just a personal goal. It was national pride wrapped in linen doilies. And teacup sizes? That was a specialty skill. Think of it like a barista certification, but for respectability. Your choice in China signaled your social literacy. Using a 6-ounce breakfast cup for a mid-afternoon visitor was a bit like offering a big gulp at a wine tasting. You take another sip, this one a little less tentative. Your hostess, ever poised, begins discussing the merits of a smaller cup for those with nervous constitutions. She says this while maintaining the exact level of eye contact that tells you she's not just talking about those people. She's asking a question. Quietly. About you. And here comes a quirky tidbit for you. In some households, especially those emulating royal or aristocratic habits, teacup size was used to assess a woman's temperament. Large cups were said to encourage indulgence and loosen the tongue. Smaller cups, by contrast, promoted measured speech and graceful restraint. Imagine choosing your dishware based on how gossipy you want your guest to be. Some women, particularly in London's posher districts, reportedly kept entire tea services hidden until they had a better read on a visitor's character. First visit. Out comes the standard 3.5-ounce demitasse. Too chatty? Stay there. Witty and modest? Perhaps an upgrade to the coveted 4.25. And if you dared to tell a tasteful joke without also bragging about your daughter's piano exams, oh darling, you just earned a floral-rimmed 5-ouncer. Historians still argue whether these cup-driven character assessments were taken seriously or were just the product of idle drawing room speculation. But it's clear they were discussed, referenced, and sometimes weaponized. Because once you start assigning personality traits to porcelain, anything's possible. And let's be honest, there's something incredibly human about it. We still do this now, just with different symbols. Watch brands. Coffee orders. Instagram bias. An Edwardian woman didn't have hashtags, but she did have teacup sizing and monogrammed serviettes. Your hostess is in full flow now, offering a story about her cousin Edith, who once poured tea from a family heirloom pot Wedgwood, obviously, into unmatched cups during a garden party. It nearly ruined her prospects, she whispers, with just the right amount of breathless melodrama. This is your third joke. In 1906, mismatched teacups were apparently a bigger scandal than losing your hat in public, which, for the record, was its own etiquette disaster. You nod politely, trying not to laugh, because you realize now that this is part of the performance. The storytelling. The passing on of unspoken law. Housewives weren't just tea pourers, they were mythmakers. And these stories? They were warnings, allegories, and subtle boasts all at once. In fact, some of the surviving instruction manuals, those little booklets passed around homemaking circles, contain sections called case studies. Real women, real names, and their teacup mistakes immortalized like cautionary parables. One pamphlet from 1905 recounts a tale of Mrs. Lillian H., who, in a moment of flustered confusion, offered a 5.5-ounce cup to a man she later learned was the milkman's cousin posing as a suitor. The moral of the story? Always confirm credentials before pouring the strong blend. You can almost hear the narrator's voice in your head. Let that be a lesson, ladies. There's a kind of reverse engineering going on here. The cup doesn't just serve the guest, it helps define the guest. It tells you how you're meant to interact, how warm or reserved to be. And in a society where everything from skirt width to hat angle could spark commentary, having that kind of subtle social compass must have felt like a survival tool. And it went beyond just cups. Tea trays had their own unspoken signals. A tray with only 3 cups suggested a small, private gathering, often for sensitive matters. A tray with 6 or more? That was a social free-for-all. Heaven help the woman who brought out the 6-cup tray and only had biscuits to offer. You needed a spread for that. Some fringe etiquette circles even developed cup maps, sketches of the tray layout showing optimal positioning based on guest seniority. The best cup, often the most ornate, or hand-painted, was placed at the host's right-hand side and reserved for the most honored guest. The furthest left. For latecomers or, in some biting cases, the woman who hadn't yet returned your casserole dish. You're beginning to see that this wasn't just about being ladylike. It was a dance. A precise choreography of gesture, presentation, and subtle evaluation. And once you knew the steps, you could start improvising. One London hostess reportedly manipulated her entire social circle using nothing more than teacup swaps. She'd rotate a guest's usual cup for a smaller one if they displeased her. Larger if she was grooming them for a marriage match. And she never said anything. Just poured. Sipped. Smiled. Let the porcelain do the work. You glance down at your own cup again. Still modest. Respectable. But you can't help but wonder, what if someone wants the scandalously large one? What if you'd prefer to skip all the rules and drink your tea in a hearty mug, no saucer, with milk and 3 sugars? Too bad. This is Edwardian England. You'll take your 4 ounces and like it. Still, there's something strangely satisfying about it all. The order. The precision. The small victories. You think of how little agency these women were allowed outside the home and how fiercely they claimed control inside of it. Not by shouting. Not by rebellion. But through china patterns and serving rituals and well-placed teaspoons. You're playing the game now, and you're playing it well. Another guest arrives, a young woman with slightly scuffed gloves, and you watch as the hostess hands her a teacup smaller than yours. And for the first time all evening, you smile. You lean back just slightly, enough to be comfortable, but not so far that you'd seem indifferent. Because here, posture still matters. And now that you've clocked the smaller teacup handed to the newcomer, poor girl, probably still an amateur at linen folding, you realize something profound. In the Edwardian home, power doesn't always wear boots and smoke cigars. Sometimes, it wears lace gloves and serves you 3.75 ounces of Darjeeling. Across the drawing room, conversation flows like well-steeped Earl Grey. Topics flit from gardening woes to the scandal of a neighbor's daughter learning to drive, and in between, the clink of spoons and the rustle of crinolines fill the air. You watch your hostess closely now, because her movements aren't just habitual, they're practiced. Calculated. She adjusts the tea tray slightly clockwise, not a full rotation. Then she realigns the sugar bowl with the biscuit tin, so their handles form a visual line toward the door. You wouldn't have noticed it before, but now? You see it all. The design, the layers, the gentle manipulation. And that's when it hits you. Edwardian housewives weren't just following rules, they were running theaters of civility. Every tea time was a performance. And every hostess, a director, casting herself as both lead actress and unseen stage manager. Here's your mainstream historical fact for tonight. During the Edwardian period, women of the middle and upper classes were increasingly educated, but still restricted from most professions. As a result, their intellectual energy often funneled into domestic mastery. Hosting became not just a skill, but an art form. The home was their canvas. Tea, their brush. Of course, there was competition. So naturally, a secondary market arose: teacup catalogs. Glorified product lists that doubled as status manifestos. These weren't just mail-order brochures. They included elaborate narratives about each cup's origin, inspired by the gardens of Kensington, or evokes the pale skies of Sussex. If that sounds like the kind of nonsense we now reserve for shampoo bottles and scented candles, well, history repeats. Some women collected these catalogs obsessively, not just to shop, but to strategize. A hostess in Brighton reportedly annotated hers with color-coded sticky tabs: green for guests I like, red for mother-in-law deterrents, and blue for newlyweds impress. It's oddly comforting to know that even back then, passive-aggressive hospitality was alive and well. You shift your gaze to the newcomer, the one with the scuffed gloves and the too small cup, and notice she's struggling to find the handle angle that doesn't risk a pinky cramp. The hostess sees it too, and you can practically feel her silently recalibrating her internal guest chart. That's another fringe tidbit. Some Edwardian hostesses kept guest books that weren't just about names and dates. They included cup notes. Pages and pages of entries like: Miss Hartley, 4 ounces, spoke with mouth full. Mr. Travers, over-poured, not invited again. Aunt Beatrice, requested lemon again. Why? It was both hilarious and ruthless. And if it sounds excessive, maybe it was. But it was also a way for women to maintain social memory in a world that never gave them ledgers or leadership titles. If you couldn't control policy, you could control the poor. Still, historians continue to argue whether this level of domestic planning was empowering or imprisoning. Did it offer women a sense of autonomy within their confined roles? Or did it simply reinforce those roles by convincing them they mattered more than they actually did? The debate's ongoing. But what's clear is this: for some, these rituals did offer a form of agency. You couldn't vote, but you could orchestrate a Tuesday tea in such a way that 2 feuding sisters-in-law never made eye contact. You couldn't hold office, but you could decide, quietly, with surgical precision, who got the largest biscuit. And you can't help but admire the ingenuity. Some manuals even included emergency tactics for sudden guest changes. If a disliked cousin arrives unannounced, one 1910 guide advises: excuse yourself to fetch cream, remove the 4-ounce cup, and replace with a 3.25. They will notice. They will not mention it. You glance around the room again. The chatter is polite, but never frivolous. No one discusses real problems, not politics, not illness, not the creeping anxiety of a world on the brink of war. That's for men to fret about. Here, in this cushion-laced bubble, the focus is harmony. But it's a very disciplined harmony. Take, for instance, the 3-pour rule, a custom mentioned in some obscure etiquette notes found in a rural Lancashire estate. The rule: never offer more than 3 pours of tea to a guest unless they're blood-related or grieving. 4 pours suggested either desperation or romantic interest, and neither was acceptable on a Thursday. The rules get even stranger the more you look. There's something called the rim test, a whisper network among particularly fussy women, wherein you subtly examined the glaze thickness around the cup's rim. Thick rim equals practical, possibly lower class. Thin rim equals refined, cultured, just the right amount of danger. One article from 1907 refers to this as judging a book by its bevel. You try it now, feel the edge of your cup. Thin, smooth. Just a touch of elegance. Your hostess knew what she was doing. And while we're here, ever heard of seasonal sauces? No, not flavors. Actual patterns deemed appropriate only during certain months. Chrysanthemums for autumn. Bluebells for spring. Using the wrong saucer in the wrong month. That was a fashion faux pas worse than wearing wool in July. One socialite in Bath supposedly had an entire cupboard arranged by seasonal floral trend. And yes, she updated it monthly. You glance toward the tea tray again. You can tell now, those aren't just matching cups and saucers. They're seasonally matched. Pale violets, soft greens. July's palette. And the doilies underneath. Cut in a delicate leaf pattern. She's not just serving tea. She's communicating fluently in China. It's beautiful. It's obsessive. It's completely bonkers. And yet, it makes sense. Because in a world where every newspaper headline reminds you that you're powerless, there's something deeply reassuring about choosing the right saucer. About holding a 4.5-ounce cup and knowing exactly what that means for your status, your host's opinion, and your future invites. The newcomer finishes her tea, awkwardly sets the cup down, and smiles. You don't envy her. You were that guest once. Probably still are, in some rooms. But not here. Not tonight. Tonight, you're fluent in porcelain. Your saucer clinks softly as you set your cup down, a practiced movement now, casual yet perfectly choreographed. You're no longer just reacting to the performance, you're part of it. And it's in this quiet moment, as a plate of lemon curd tarts makes the rounds, that you begin to understand something deeper about Edwardian teacup etiquette. This wasn't just about tea. It was about control, beautifully disguised as civility. The Edwardian housewife, often trapped by corsets and conventions, used the rituals of tea time as her own quiet rebellion. The world outside might be governed by Parliament, but in the parlor, she ruled supreme. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Edwardian era, 1901 to 1910, though the culture stretched into the 1910s, was a period of contradiction. Britain was industrially booming but socially rigid. Women were increasingly involved in education and activism, yet expected to prioritize family, home, and appearance. In that friction-filled space, the home became a stage for subtle power plays, and the teacup, her smallest but sharpest prop. You watch now as the conversation shifts effortlessly from flower beds to fashion, and your hostess, ever alert, refills a guest's cup just a touch too soon. A quiet nudge, your story's gone on long enough. The guest complies, chuckling politely and biting into a biscuit that tastes faintly of almond and forewarning. And here's a delightful fringe tidbit. Some women trained themselves in silent communication through saucer tilt. Yes, tilt. A saucer held parallel. Conversation is still fresh. Tilted forward ever so slightly. Time to move along, dear. One etiquette guide even warned that a haphazard saucer tilt may ruin 3 months' worth of social harmony. Imagine living in a world where crockery angle could ruin your Tuesday. But let's dig deeper, shall we? You may have noticed by now that this wasn't a free-for-all. Tea time had tiers. And not just the kind that held your scones and cucumber sandwiches. There were clearly defined guest categories, first-tier guests like the vicar's wife, the well-married cousin, or that one woman who'd once seen the king drive past her carriage. Then there were second-tier guests, your butcher's niece, the new neighbor with opinions about wallpaper, or anyone with visibly cheap gloves. Teacup sizing became part of the hierarchy. First-tier guests got the full tea experience, larger cups, second helpings, sugar tongs that actually matched the teaspoons. Second-tier guests. Smaller cups, one refill max, and a biscuit so dry it doubled as a coaster's. And then there was a rarely spoken category, the trial guest. You might be one. Or you might have just graduated. Either way, the trial guest was someone being vetted. Not for scandal or seduction, but for rhythm. Did they match the room? Could they balance etiquette with charm? Did they notice the teaspoon handle facing away from them and subtly correct it? Historians still argue whether this guest ranking system was standardized across regions or more fluid, dependent on the hostess's social ambitions. But diary entries from women in Norfolk, Sussex, and even Glasgow all hint at some form of this unspoken structure. Tea wasn't just refreshment. It was screening. One diary from a London hostess lists a guest's performance like a school report. Mrs. Fenwick, punctual, polite, asked about the teapot's origin. B+. Might try 4.75 ounces next time. Miss Doyle, over-talked, took 3 sugars, laughed at her own story. C-. Keep at 3.25. Brutal? Sure. But efficient. Now, remember that earlier nod to catalogues? Here's where it gets juicy. Because beyond just ordering new cups, women began to curate their collections with intention. A smart hostess kept at least 3 cup sets of varying sizes and designs. Not for aesthetics, but for social engineering. She could match guest to cup faster than you can say bone china. And the packaging. Some of these teacups came in boxes with poetic insert cards, for gentle conversation and milky blends, or for sharp tongues and strong pours. They read like fortune cookies for Edwardian sensibilities. Some women, especially in cities like Bath or York, even held private workshops, little training circles in which younger women were taught how to read the tea table. It wasn't enough to pour without dribbling. You needed to understand the signals. One such manual included a practice sheet showing how to interpret 6 different cup placements and what they said about the guest's personality. Imagine Edwardian flashcards, but with saucers. Here's your third joke of the night. One nervous woman in 1908 reportedly switched her guest's cup 3 times during a single visit, accidentally signaling flirtation, mourning, and spiritual crisis in the span of 20 minutes. And yes, the guest left deeply confused and slightly complimented. But perhaps the most fascinating element of all? The transparency of it. Everyone knew these signals existed. They just pretended not to. It was like a polite arms race. You act as though you're just pouring tea. I act as though I haven't noticed my cup has a less ornate rim than hers, and we both move forward, sipping and smiling like nothing happened. This performance of obliviousness was itself an expectation. One etiquette instructor wrote, "To be shrewd without being sharp, observant without being obvious, this is the highest art of domestic interaction." So yes, your cup size said something about you. But your reaction to it said even more. Get offended. You've lost. Make a witty joke. You're playing the long game. Respond by complimenting your hostess's choice of cup as perfectly suited. Darling, you're a contender. And there were consequences, too. Use the wrong cup on the wrong person, and they might never forget. One woman in Devon reportedly declined a wedding invitation 10 years later on the grounds that she'd once been served from the thistle-handled 3 ounces by the bride's mother. "I've not the constitution," she claimed in a letter, "for a family that still thinks me minor." You exhale slowly, the room now a quiet hum of porcelain and politeness, and you realize something. This was more than ritual. It was a language, spoken by women who'd been told to stay silent in nearly every other realm. Their tools weren't ballots or bullhorns, but teaspoons, biscuit tins, and cup handles aligned at 45-degree angles. And you're speaking it now. Maybe not fluently, but enough to be understood. You accept a second tart, this time with a confident thank you. The hostess nods. just slightly. Not approval, but recognition. Welcome to the inner ring. You adjust in your seat, a little straighter now, not out of stiffness but intention. You know where you are, socially, symbolically, and saucer-wise. The rhythm of the tea table beats subtly beneath the chatter, and you, dear listener, are tapping right along. But behind all this polite ceremony lies something a little more ambitious, the growing influence of Edwardian consumerism. By now, you've clocked the teacups, the saucers, the floral arrangements, each with just the right touch of understatement, and begun to realize none of it is accidental. Nothing in this room just happens. Every item is curated. And teacups, they're not just for tea anymore. They're for advertising status. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the early 1900s, Britain saw an explosion of consumer culture. Department stores thrived, mail-order catalogs multiplied, and the middle class gained access to goods that had previously been reserved for the elite. This meant one thing, the rise of the competitive parlor. Your hostess, for instance, might have ordered her entire set from Harrods, or claimed she did. And yes, Harrods did indeed sell individual teacups at eye-watering prices, with patterns like Summer Rose Whispers or Imperial Dusk. Never mind if those patterns had ever existed in nature, if they sounded expensive, they worked. And there's your fringe tidbit. Some cup patterns were pure fiction, designed not by artists, but marketing men with typewriters and gin habits. Eastern Moonlight? Probably just lavender with dots. Duchess Twilight? A smudgy grey made to feel luxurious with a gold rim and a whisper of colonial mystique. It worked. Women bought not just cups, but the idea of the cups. One catalogue from 1906 offered a set called the Gentlewoman's Progression. It came with 5 cups, each meant to be used at a different point in the week, reflecting your energy level. Monday, crisp white, practical, straight-sided. Wednesday, scalloped edge, tiny birds, slightly optimistic. Friday, pale mauve, flecks of gold, absolutely exhausted. You can't help but imagine an Edwardian woman flopped in a fainting chair, sipping strong tea from her Friday cup, muttering, "I simply cannot deal with Helen again until Monday." Historians still argue whether these marketed personas empowered women to embrace new roles or subtly kept them boxed into performative identities. On one hand, women were creating meaning and curating taste. On the other, they were still bound by the idea that even their tea-drinking moods had to be stylishly branded. And it wasn't just about taste, it was about matching. The Edwardian hostess knew that serving Darjeeling in a deep blue cup might overpower the visual tone. A green transferware cup? Better for chamomile. Heaven forbid you put oolong in a cup with a silver rim, it made the infusion look muddy. Yes, there were color pairing rules for teas. And they were dead serious. One widely circulated home journal advised women to keep a tea color chart in their parlor cabinet. This laminated, or occasionally velvet-bound, guide offered ideal pairings like Earl Grey plus soft pastels equals harmonious and modern. Assam plus ivory equals strength framed in restraint. Lapsang Souchong plus black and gold equals mysterious, if slightly aggressive. And if you were caught mismatching, the consequences weren't verbal, they were eye-based. One glance from a discerning aunt across the table, and you'd know. You'd just know. You're sipping now, confidently. Your cup is a perfect muted coral, the tea inside a medium amber. The two glow together in the soft light like they were born of the same dream. You're doing it. You're living the palette. But as you settle further into the story, let's zoom out. Because all this teacup mania wasn't happening in isolation. The Edwardian woman, smart, social, and increasingly aware of the world beyond her town, was under immense pressure to perform sophistication. Newspapers ran articles on tea-based diplomacy, describing how wives of political men were expected to set the tone through hospitality. That's right. International relations often began with bone china. One famed anecdote involves a 1909 garden tea between a minor British diplomat's wife and the visiting sister of a Spanish ambassador. The hostess, aiming to impress, served from a rare Italian porcelain set trimmed in lilac. Unfortunately, lilac was considered a mourning color in Spain. The tea, tense. The biscuits, untouched. The treaty, delayed 6 weeks. That's the kind of mistake no Edwardian housewife wanted to make. So she studied. Not just etiquette books, but style magazines, cultural columns, and even anthropology reports. There was a kind of armchair diplomacy at work in the home, and the teacup, ridiculously dainty as it might be, was at the center of it. Some even wrote in to newspapers asking about symbolism. One column, titled Your Cup, Your Creed, fielded questions like, is it too political to serve in green? Does a gold-rimmed cup suggest greed? Can floral cups still be used in November? And the answers were often maddeningly vague. A floral cup in November may imply wistfulness if paired with honey, but desperation if paired with marmalade. Imagine trying to decode that before your in-laws show up. But here's something sweet, and a little odd, children weren't left out. Young girls were often given miniature tea sets, not for play, but for practice. Teeny versions of adult rituals, designed to teach etiquette early. And we're not talking plastic toy sets. We're talking fragile porcelain, just scaled down. One instruction manual for girls aged 7 to 11 advised, let the girl feel the weight of her teacup. She must understand it reflects her burden and her grace. You blink at that. Her burden and her grace. For a child. Holding a 2-ounce cup. It's equal parts tragic and oddly beautiful. Your hostess now stands and offers another pour, but this time, there's no tray. She's walking the pot around, refilling with personal touch. It's risky, walking the room invites imbalance. But also connection. It's a move of confidence. And now you see, every choice is layered. The color of the cup. The style of the pot. The height from which she pours. Each element sends a signal, not loud, not direct, but unmistakable to anyone listening. And you, dear listener, are listening. You've cracked the code. You catch her eye briefly and smile. Not too wide, just enough. She sees that you've noticed the matching sugar cube tongs. She sees that you're seated slightly closer to the window, in a spot that suggests rising favor. She sees you seeing her. And that's the magic of it, isn't it? These cups weren't about function. They were about fluency. A kind of conversational shorthand, porcelain punctuation in a dialogue of glances, gestures, and silent rankings. You're no longer just holding a cup. You're holding a chapter in a centuries-old conversation. And your hands, perfectly steady. You're warm now, steeped in tradition like the tea itself. Your hands cradle the cup with quiet authority. There's a gentle murmur across the room, conversation flowing like the second steep of Earl Grey, smoother than the first, but richer, fuller. It's in these lingering minutes that the unexpected players of the Edwardian tea world begin to emerge. You glance to your right, and there she is, the spinster aunt. Unmarried, opinionated, and wielding a teacup like it's a monocle into your soul. These women were rarely the hostesses, but often the watchdogs of the parlor. They knew the rules better than the rules knew themselves. Mainstream historical fact time. Unmarried women of a certain age in Edwardian England often lived with relatives, either helping manage the household or assisting with moral balance, which is a lovely euphemism for saying they watched everyone like hawks and issued unsanctioned critiques after dessert. Especially if the sponge cake was dry. But here's the twist, these so-called maiden aunts were sometimes the keepers of the best tea knowledge. While others married, birthed, and bustled, these women often had the time and focus to master the minutiae of domestic culture. They became connoisseurs of blends, decorators of parlors, collectors of mismatched but meaningful cups. Your fringe tidbit: there was an entire subculture of unmarried Edwardian women who exchanged handwritten newsletters on teacup symbolism. Called the Porcelain Circle, it consisted of over 40 women from across Britain who would send each other monthly musings, poems, critiques, even etiquette quizzes. One surviving entry from 1907 begins, "A wide brim may suggest generosity, but paired with a short handle, it verges on vulgar." Vulgar. Over a handle. And they were dead serious. You begin to understand that these women weren't background characters in the tea story, they were quiet architects of it. They remembered which guest had been served what cup last summer. They knew which glaze styles were subtly falling out of fashion. They could spot a clumsily mismatched saucer across the room, and they'd mention it exactly once under their breath, to the lady with the clearest conscience, just to watch it travel like a rumor. Historians still argue whether this network of spinster tea mavens was widespread or a peculiar anomaly in a few counties. But the archives of several tea clubs in Kent, Bristol, and Edinburgh suggest these women took their role quite seriously. One even labelled herself in a guestbook as Aunt of Cups, Guardian of Grace. You imagine her now, hair like a modest thundercloud, eyes sharp enough to slice a lemon wedge without blinking, sipping from a tulip-rimmed cup with the solemnity of a priest at communion. She's watching you. Judging you, yes, but also rooting for you. She knows how hard it is to remember not to clink your spoon against the side of your cup. Another player enters the scene, the household servant. Often overlooked in these dainty stories, the parlor maid or kitchen girl was crucial to the tea experience. She didn't just brew the tea. She laid out the cups, polished the silver tongs, and crucially remembered the preferred cup for each guest. If she got it wrong, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a social rupture. There's a delicious detail here. Some wealthier Edwardian homes kept a teacup ledger, maintained by the head housemaid or sometimes the lady of the house herself. In it, names, seating preferences, known dislikes, cup style used last visit, and any notable reactions. Sample entry from a 1908 London household. Mrs. Grantham prefers lighter cups. Avoid navy. Did not finish third biscuit. Possibly dieting or ill. Avoid jam. You're not imagining things. That's some MI5 level intelligence gathering. And here's your second light joke. One servant's diary tells of a guest so particular about her cup's rim shape that the household actually hired a potter to retool a slightly too straight design. The guest never noticed. But she did finish all her tea. Servants also became secret arbiters of taste. If a maid liked you, your cup arrived ever so slightly warmer, your lemon slice precisely fanned. If she didn't, the sugar was clumpy and the milk was this close to off. And that brings us to the third, often underestimated participant in this ritual, the cup maker. While aristocrats and upwardly mobile hostesses were ordering elaborate china patterns, someone had to make them. Enter the potters, many of them anonymous, working long hours in Staffordshire kilns. The Edwardian era was the heyday of British pottery. Factories like Wedgwood, Royal Doulton, and Spode were booming, and even lower-tier makers had waiting lists. Each cup style, each rim detail, each underglaze floral design had to be hand-finished. Some potters prided themselves on adding a hidden signature, like a single red dot beneath the handle or a petal that pointed eastward instead of west. Fringe trivia. One Staffordshire potter created a rebellious batch in 1906 where every cup was intentionally half an ounce larger than labelled out of protest that men got to drink pints while women were restricted to sips. The line was called the Generous Lady. It sold well, and the potter was never credited. But the tea world felt the ripple. Cup collectors took note. Some hostesses began ordering Generous Lady styles on purpose, especially those sympathetic to the suffrage movement. There was, for a brief window, a quiet alliance between cup sizing and women's rights. An extra half-ounce. That was practically an open letter to Parliament. Historians still debate whether this was a widespread phenomenon or clever marketing piggybacking on a political moment. Either way, it worked. Tea became a venue for protest wrapped in politeness. Sip by sip, revolution simmered beneath the surface. You shift slightly, noticing how natural it feels to hold the cup just so. You're aware now of the story in your hand. Who made it? Who poured into it? Who judged it? Who defended it? All those invisible fingerprints left by generations of women, silent architects of domestic power, each stirring her spoon exactly twice and setting it down with purpose. And you think about today, don't you? About how we still try to signal our stories through objects. The right mug on a Zoom call. The curated shelf in the background. The silent agreement that some brands whisper more than others. It's not so different. You finish your tea. The hostess is offering seconds again, and this time, she presents the pot to you with a little smile, like she knows you know what this means. And oh yes, you do. The tea's gone tepid in your cup, but you don't mind. By now, you've become part of the ritual, folded into the rhythm like sugar into milk. A participant. An observer. A quiet collector of secrets poured out over china rims. And tonight's secret. The performative skill of pouring itself. See, you've been watching the hostess move with grace, elbows close, pot tilted just so, stream never splashing. But this isn't instinct. It's rehearsal. Pouring tea in Edwardian England was more than just gravity plus china. It was a demonstration of control, of practiced elegance, of social fluency in full display. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. In upper-middle-class homes, young women were trained in tea-pouring technique by governesses or etiquette instructors. The skill was considered as essential as penmanship or piano. You were expected to pour at least 3 cups in succession without dripping, without over-serving, and this is critical, without disturbing the leaf settlement if the tea had been steeped loose. Imagine your high school exams involved boiling water, rotating wrists with wristwatch precision, and interpreting guest hierarchy through teacup size. But it gets better. Here's your fringe tidbit. There were tea pouring competitions at some finishing schools. Real events. Scored. Judged. With criteria like smoothness of pour arc, proper finger placement on pot handle, minimal sound of splash, elegance of presentation, i.e., did the sugar tongs match your brooch? Winners received porcelain medals. One surviving medal reads, Miss L. Standish, Gold and Graceful Serving, 1905. And somewhere, probably in a dusty drawer, lies a silver spoon inscribed, For Perfect Temp and Tempo. This was more than pageantry, it was power. The pourer directed attention, controlled flow, determined pace. She was the metronome of the conversation, choosing who received warmth and when. A slight pause between fills could signal doubt. A quick top-up might hint favor. Or pressure. Or even passive aggression, if delivered with a too-sweet smile. You glance again at the hostess now. Her pot has shifted to her left hand. Her right gestures delicately toward the cakes. It's a maneuver of trust, ambidextrous authority, and you realize she's showing off. Softly. Subtly. But definitely. Of course, not all houses had a resident tea queen. In larger gatherings, especially those involving relatives or committees, those two being equally dangerous, the pourer might be delegated. And this choice alone could stir a tempest in the bone china. Historians still argue whether pouring was always a privilege or sometimes a social trap. Some believe that younger women were asked to pour as a sign of favor, elevating them, showing they were ready to manage the table. Others argue it was a form of hazing, gently humiliating them in public if they weren't skilled. Either way, it mattered. In one particularly notorious anecdote from a 1908 charity tea in Bath, a young woman reportedly poured a guest's tea too hot, splashing slightly onto the saucer. The guest, Lady Wickham, famous for her disdain of all things lukewarm, refused to touch it, then said loudly, "Ah, a cup for the hasty-hearted." The poor girl didn't attend another gathering for 6 months. 6. Which brings us to the darker side of the teacup, the politics of shame. Not everyone was welcome in every parlor. Invitations were tactical. Cups were ranked, and so were guests. There's a term whispered behind doors back then, the humbler porcelain. It referred to a perfectly serviceable teacup, no cracks, no chips, but just plainer. No gold. A safe color. Slightly heavier. And often reserved for those of lower status. You didn't say anything, of course. You simply placed the humbler cup at the edge of the tray, offered it without fanfare, and waited for the guest to notice. Or not. That was half the sport. It was petty, yes, but also encoded. Polite society didn't duel anymore. It decanted. And here's your light joke number 1. One woman's diary notes that she once gave a humble cup to her cousin's new fiancé on purpose, just to test his pedigree. He didn't flinch. She approved the marriage. True love, filtered through porcelain. But don't let this high society game distract you from the middle-class ingenuity brewing quietly in the background. Because down in Leeds, Sheffield, Birmingham, the cities away from the powdered drawing rooms, a different kind of tea story was steeping. The kind where women, newly married or independently renting small flats, wanted elegance without the drama. These women didn't have 10 cups to rotate. They had 3, maximum. But oh, they made them count. Catalogues began offering versatile tri-cups, sets of 3 that could suit any occasion if played right. One for guests, one for casual use, one for impression management. With detachable saucers, no less. A marketing leaflet from 1909 reads, "No space? No shame. Our tea trio does the job of a dozen. Impress at pennies. Pour with pride." Iconic. Fringe moment, one of the best-selling teacup designs of the Edwardian working class. The illusion rose. It had a pattern that changed slightly with heat, a kind of early thermochromic glaze. When hot tea was poured, hidden rosebuds appeared. It was utterly charming, surprisingly affordable, and reportedly caused gasps the first time someone used it. And yes, the elite mocked it, called it parlor magic. But they also quietly bought them for second homes. Historians still discuss whether these heat-sensitive designs were originally artistic gimmicks or coded expressions of subtle rebellion. Either way, they offered joy on a budget, and sometimes, that's the best kind. You stretch now, imagining the weight of a well-loved, slightly chipped cup in a woman's hand, her only one, maybe, but chosen, cherished, hers. She's pouring for a friend. A neighbor. Maybe herself. No scorecards. No judgment. Just tea and a soft afternoon light through net curtains. And yet the skill remains. You can't help but respect it. Pouring well is hard. Try it tomorrow, seriously. Take your nicest mug, fill a teapot, and aim for silence. No splashes. No drips. If you make it, you have earned your ghostly Edwardian medal. Just don't forget to lift the pot slightly on the finish. There's a subtle flair to it, a kind of punctuation. Like saying, "You may speak now." As your hostess refills your cup once more, with an elegance you now fully see, you raise your eyebrows slightly in quiet admiration. She notices. She knows. You've passed some invisible test. And as you take that first sip of the second pour, the tea tastes warmer. Better. Richer. Not because the leaves are different, but because you know the stakes now. This isn't just tea. It's choreography. The second pour always tastes more intimate. The nerves are gone, your posture loosens an inch, and you let your eyes wander a little more freely across the room. This time, it's not just a space, it's a map. And every cup, every saucer, every layered lace doily, a marker in a social topography that's deeper than it first appeared. Tonight, you're tuning in to the rituals of guest ranking, a game played not with scorecards or seating charts, but with porcelain. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. Edwardian hostesses, especially in upper and upper-middle class households, used teacup assignment as a coded system of guest status. It wasn't just about beauty or theme. A cup's style, origin, or rarity often reflected the esteem in which a guest was held. You might not be seated at the head of the table, but if you're handed a Royal Worcester hand-painted cup rimmed in platinum, you're being told, "I see you. And I care what you whisper to the vicar's wife." On the other hand, if your cup is a simple transferware with a faint crack that's been discreetly glazed over, well, it might be time to reconsider that gossip column you submitted last week. Fringe detail time. In some households, the cup hierarchy was so nuanced that daughters of the family kept a handwritten key hidden behind the tea caddy. Found in a Wiltshire home in 1982, one such list reads: Miss Deacon equals Blue Imari, emotional, don't challenge. Cousin Beatty equals Ivy Garland, safe, if dull. Mr. Harris equals no florals, only geometrics. Brandy spiked if needed. You blink. Brandy spiked. That's a twist. But yes, in some houses, the teacup you were handed didn't just signify your standing, it also predicted your behavior. And perhaps managed it. Historians still debate whether these cup codes were conscious manipulation or just the natural extension of a class system obsessed with subtleties. Either way, the cups didn't lie. Guests knew when they were promoted or demoted. You might not be told you've fallen from favor, but if your handle's thicker and your saucer no longer matches, message received. Of course, there's always the drama of the new guest. Someone's fiancé, a visiting cousin, a scholar from the continent. Where do you put them? What do you serve them in? The wrong choice risks embarrassment. The right one becomes legend. There's a tale from an East Sussex hostess who once received the daughter of a Russian diplomat, an unknown entity with suspected noble blood but no title. The solution? A teacup with no pattern whatsoever. Just bone-white porcelain, fine as frost. Elegant, yes, but emotionally neutral. No signals. No offense. And the best part? The guest adored it. Called it honest. She later sent the hostess a hand-painted samovar in gratitude. But we mustn't forget, Edwardian etiquette didn't run solely on symbolism. It relied on a kind of parlor memory. Hostesses were expected to recall which cup they'd given you last time, serve you the same again or switch it intentionally, and let the guest wonder what it meant. And now, your first light joke of the section. One woman reportedly kept a ledger just for emotional tracking, a record of how each guest responded to their cup. She once noted, Mrs. Caldwell furrowed brow at rose stripe, assign tulip handle next visit. Possibly suspects me of sarcasm. Paranoid? Maybe. But that's the Edwardian parlor for you. One part hospitality, one part psychological chess. Now, let's zoom out. Because this system, bizarre as it seems, had consequences far beyond tea hour. Those who were consistently handed the finer cups were often the ones whose invitations carried weight. If your name appeared regularly in high-tier tea circles, you gained social capital, recommendations, even marriage prospects. It was LinkedIn, but with better lace and more sponge cake. Some modern scholars argue that Edwardian women developed their own economy of influence through these rituals. Locked out of parliamentary power and university halls, they turned to what they had: rooms, teapots, cups, and made them into courts of judgment. It's worth noting how many notable Edwardian hostesses, women who had no public office or legal authority, ended up shaping local decisions. School board members, charity committee appointees, even which florist was deemed reputable. All of it hashed out in whispers over shortbread and clinking saucers. But here's where things get spicy. Every now and then, someone defied the code. Either out of ignorance or rebellion, they brought their own cup. Yes, that happened. Not frequently. But when it did, oh, the scandal. A 1910 account from Norwich tells of a Mrs. Langtry who arrived at a tea party with her own cup and saucer, wrapped in linen, nestled in a velvet pouch. She claimed it was due to medical concerns, but later admitted she simply preferred to trust her own pattern. The hostess reportedly went pale. Someone dropped a fork. The room fell silent. Fringe tidbit. That same Mrs. Langtry ended up forming the Personal Porcelain Society, a club for like-minded women who traveled with custom teacups. Membership peaked at 14, then dissolved because, unsurprisingly, no one could agree whose turn it was to host. Historians still argue whether bringing your own cup was a subtle power move or a tasteless faux pas. Some even suggest it was a precursor to modern dietary preferences, like bringing your own oat milk to brunch. You take another sip now, and the flavor feels layered not from the tea, but from everything it carries. There's memory in the porcelain. There's a whole social ledger in every clink of the spoon. And suddenly, you're aware of the weight of the cup, not physical, but symbolic. You're not just drinking. You're participating. You've earned your way into this ritual. And yet, you wonder, what cup did they give you? Was it the one for respected thinkers? Loyal companions? Or have you been sipping from the watch this one saucer the whole time? You glance again at your china. Pale blue. Gold filigree. No chips. Handle like a swan's neck. It's elegant. Possibly the testing for subtlety model. Or maybe it's just the host's favorite, and she wanted you to feel welcome. The mystery stays with you. You won't ask. Of course not. You'll just be sure to notice what cup she gives you next time. Your hands cradle the cup a little more thoughtfully now. The warmth has soaked into your fingertips, and the rim kisses your lips with that familiar delicate curve. But something's shifted, hasn't it? You're not just sipping tea, you're decoding it. Listening, even, to the unsaid. And tonight, you tune in closer to the emotional life of the teacup. Yes, that sounds dramatic. But stay with it, because in Edwardian households, where a woman couldn't always speak her mind aloud, her choice of teacup could whisper everything. Regret. Rebellion. Longing. A very British sort of grief. Let's start grounded with your mainstream historical fact. Victorians had already established mourning customs in material goods, but Edwardians took it one step subtler. A widow might not dress in full black every day, but she'd quietly switch to her mourning teacup, often matte, often solid dark tones, with subdued gold. It was not a catalogued rule, but one that percolated through upper-class norms. Emotional states deserved their own serviceware. Which means that during your afternoon visit, if your hostess served you from a charcoal grey Shelley with a faded rim, she might be telling you she's still grieving even if it's been 2 years since her husband's funeral. Or she might be mourning something she can't speak of. A friend fallen from favour. A child lost too soon. A country changing too fast. Fringe moment. In some communities, especially in rural Kent and parts of Wales, women created private morning tea rituals that included a single cup placed untouched on the table for the one who had passed. The family would set it out every Sunday for a year. No tea. Just presents. You imagine that now. A quiet table. One empty chair. One untouched teacup facing the garden. Not every sorrow was so solemn, though. There was the lighter grief of lost love, unspoken dreams, or seasonal sadness. In these cases, Women curated what was affectionately called a blue mood cup. Often pale blue with silver leaf, these cups weren't necessarily sad, but they let your guests know, "Don't bring up Aunt Nell or that letter from the ministry." Historians still debate whether these practices were widespread or mostly confined to introspective spinsters and spiritually inclined widows. But what's clear is this: teacups gave women a way to feel without explaining themselves. And if grief had a cup, so did joy. There were engagement cups, floral, almost too cheerful, usually part of a newly gifted set. There were good luck cups used before interviews, exams, or husband-hunting garden parties. These were more about ritual than beauty. One such design, passed down through 3 generations of one Midlands family, featured an odd hybrid of thistles and violets and was known as the prosperity mug. No one liked how it looked, but it worked, allegedly. And now, for your light joke, one diary entry from 1911 recalls a young woman so convinced of her cup's lucky powers that she took it on a steam train ride to meet a suitor. When the train jolted and the cup broke, she cried for 15 minutes. Then married the suitor 2 weeks later anyway. The spell had already taken, she wrote. But there's more to this emotional range than mere superstition. Sometimes, a teacup became a confessional space. You wouldn't write it down. You wouldn't say it out loud. But you'd pour yourself a cup, stare into the swirling cream, and think the thing. The forbidden thing. The angry thought. The what if. And the cup understood. Maybe that's why women kept certain teacups long after their sets shattered or their glaze cracked. They didn't throw them out. They kept them behind cupboards, in hat boxes, on top of wardrobes. Sometimes wrapped in newspaper. Sometimes tucked in velvet. One woman's will even specified that her chipped rose cup be buried with her. It had been her first, she wrote. Her thinking cup. You sit with that now. The idea that a simple piece of china can carry decades of secrets. The things you sipped through. The things you survived while pretending to enjoy Earl Grey. And here's something curious. There's growing academic interest in how Edwardian teacups functioned almost like emotional journaling tools. Scholars point to patterns, both literal and metaphorical, used by women to process moods, rehearse bravery, or preserve some sense of private autonomy. One study even suggests that certain recurring cup choices correlated with periods of personal upheaval. If you always reached for the same scalloped edge when worried, that wasn't just taste. That was muscle memory. That was emotional architecture. Of course, not every emotional teacup had poetic origins. Sometimes, a cup was just the one you could afford after a particularly expensive doctor's bill. Or the one you stole back from your in-laws after they borrowed it indefinitely. Yes, that happened too. Petty teacup feuds. There's a story of 2 sisters who didn't speak for 3 years over a misplaced saucer. When they reconciled, it was by exchanging identical replacements. Peace offerings, with handles. Fringe story. A woman in Essex kept a locked drawer labeled emotional inventory where she stored 5 teacups, each representing a different past relationship. One had a hairline crack. One had a gilded lip. One had been dropped and repaired with old-school ceramic staples. Each one told a love story, though she never said whose. You sip your tea now, eyes lingering on your own cup. If this were your house, what story would it tell? What memories would it hold in its curved bowl? Maybe your first heartbreak. Or your first laugh after a long silence. Maybe the time you sat by the window and watched the world rain itself clean. And here's your second light joke. Somewhere in Yorkshire, a woman reportedly had a no-crying teacup. A bright yellow one with forget-me-nots. Her daughters say if they saw her holding that one, they knew she was trying not to fall apart. Mum's in her sunshine armor, they'd whisper. And then give her a biscuit. Even now, antique dealers sometimes say you can feel a vibe off certain cups. Not haunted, exactly. Just Emotionally busy. As if they've absorbed decades of thoughts, sighs, fears. A kind of porcelain empathy. Historians still argue whether these emotional layers are historically provable or simply human projection. But it doesn't matter, really. You feel it. You know. There's one last, strange tale from the Edwardian age, a woman who believed that her teacup could store emotions. Like, literally hold them. She'd whisper her troubles into it before bed. Then, in the morning, she'd rinse it out with boiling water, watching the steam rise like smoke from a vanishing memory. Her granddaughter found this out only after her passing and tried it once herself. She swore it helped. So, as your cup empties now, you wonder, what, if anything, has it taken from you tonight? What sorrow did it sip away quietly while you listened and imagined and softened into sleep? You don't need to know. That's the beauty of it. It's doing the work for you. You just finish your tea. Let it hold what you can't. Steam curls lazily from your cup, the swirl soft and almost dreamlike. You lean back slightly now, more relaxed, letting the porcelain nestle into your palm like it's always been there. That's the thing about routines, they build themselves around you, until they feel like old friends. Or in this case, like loyal china. But routines need more than habit. They need tools, instruments. And tonight, you're invited into the tucked-away drawers, polished cabinets, and velvet-lined cases of the supporting cast of the teacup. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. In Edwardian households, the act of taking tea was never just about cup and saucer. It was an entire production involving specialized accessories, from sugar tongs to lemon forks, from tea strainers to waste bowls. Yes, waste bowls. And no, not for dramatic exits. These were dainty little dishes set on the tea table to collect spent tea leaves, cold dregs, or lemon slices that had outlived their usefulness. Picture a porcelain graveyard for citrus peels and regrets. Every accessory had its place and its own miniature etiquette code. Sugar tongs, for instance, were essential. You never used fingers, even if you just washed your hands. That's what tongs were for, elegance and boundaries. They were often engraved, passed down like cufflinks or brooches. One Glasgow heiress reportedly had her initials monogrammed on 6 different pairs, each in a different metal. Monday was for sterling. Friday was for gilt. And if you think that's excessive, meet the teaspoon hierarchy. Because yes, not all spoons were created equal. Some were specifically designated for stirring milk into lapsang. Others, reserved only for elderflower cordial, served chilled in tiny teacups during spring. Fringe tidbit. A known eccentric in Bath kept a separate spoon labelled mope only. No one touched it unless they were in a brooding mood. Legend says it was slightly bent from all the dramatic stirs. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or isolated to the kind of households with footmen and too many hat pins. But the objects themselves, they're real. And still turn up in antique shops, each with their own strange sense of memory. One such object, nearly forgotten today, was the teacup cover. Imagine a thin, embroidered circle of linen or lace, like a miniature doily, with tiny weights sewn into the corners. Its purpose? To cover your tea while you stepped away, preserving warmth and preventing dust. Or insects. Or your cousin Thomas's unsolicited peppermint drops. Another curiosity? The moustache cup. Yes, that's a real thing. A specially designed teacup with a built-in porcelain guard near the rim, meant to protect a gentleman's facial hair from becoming damp or stained. Quite popular among dashing uncles and the occasional awkward poet. Some were even painted with faux moustaches for flair. You pause now and tilt your head. Because somewhere in your own kitchen drawer, isn't there a utensil you keep just because it feels right? A wooden spoon that outstirs the others? An old chipped mug that still makes cocoa taste like childhood. The Edwardians understood that too. Which is why many tea accessories became deeply personal. One woman from Surrey carried her own tea strainer in a leather pouch. Silver mesh, slight dent. She claimed it made the Darjeeling just right. Her daughter later said it was her mother's way of filtering out the bad news. Light joke here. In one London boarding school, a particularly fussy teacher was known for bringing her own teaspoon to morning break. When a student borrowed it to stir ink as a prank, she held a full memorial service and wore black gloves for the rest of the week. The spoon was returned anonymously, polished and repentant. But beyond the silliness lies something poignant. These tools offered a sense of control in a world that didn't offer much, especially to women. When the politics outside were unpredictable, when futures weren't always your own to shape, you could still arrange a tray. Still polish the tongs. Still unfold the napkin in thirds and align the handles at just the right angle. It was more than habit, it was ritual as reassurance. Some scholars suggest these accessories served as a kind of armor, lace-lined and silver-plated. They let you claim space, create order, assert refinement. And of course, there was the tea caddy, a small box, often ornate, sometimes locked. This was the keeper of the leaves themselves. Some were lined in lead or pewter. Others had compartments for different blends, Assam, Ceylon, China black. In earlier centuries, tea was so expensive it was kept under literal lock and key, the key worn around the lady of the house's neck. That custom softened by Edwardian times, but the symbol of stewardship remained. A well-tended tea caddy said, "I take this seriously. I curate. I protect." One caddy, found in the attic of a Norfolk estate, contained not just tea but tiny folded paper notes, recipes, affirmations, even pressed flower petals. It was a box of small comforts. A ritual toolkit disguised as a beverage box. Historians still debate whether these layered uses were conscious forms of quiet resistance or simply the natural evolution of female domestic creativity. But either way, they mattered. You glance around now, imagining that tea table in full bloom. A lacy cloth. A bell to summon the tray. The gentle clink of silver against china. A lemon fork poised like a tiny question mark. And here's another light joke for you. One memoir recalls a woman who insisted on arranging her accessories in perfect clockwise order until a mischievous niece rearranged them counterclockwise. The hostess poured the tea backwards, flicked milk onto her lap, and declared it a cosmic insult. The niece was never invited again. But she did later publish a book of tea-related poetry. There's something delightfully human about all this, the fussing, the precision, the emotional investment in objects that outsiders might dismiss as trivial. But to the Edwardians, these were anchors. Tangible links to order, memory, and meaning. So as your cup rests empty again and your eyes grow heavier, you realize you haven't just been learning about teacups, you've been learning about how people survive. One teaspoon, one saucer, one ritual at a time. The air feels thicker now, like it's been steeped too. You shift your weight just slightly, and your cup clinks gently in the silence, like a soft little bell reminding you you're still here. Still listening. Still part of this long, strange legacy. Because tonight, your journey takes you into the realm of repair when teacups cracked, but weren't thrown away. Not right away, anyway. You may have broken a cup or two yourself. A dropped favorite. A chipped rim that made your lips nervous. Maybe you tossed it, or maybe it still sits there, near the back of the cupboard, holding loose batteries or forgotten thumbtacks. But in Edwardian households, a broken teacup was not the end. At least, not always. Let's begin with your mainstream historical fact. Before mass production truly democratized teaware, households often repaired valuable or sentimental china rather than discard it. This wasn't seen as miserly, it was an art form, a statement of continuity. And it had a name, staple repair. Picture this. You've dropped your beloved porcelain teacup. It's in 2 pieces. Instead of mourning its demise and heading to the local shop, you take it to a china mender. There, skilled hands drill tiny holes into both sides of the crack and insert minuscule brass or copper staples, fastening the break together like a surgeon stitching flesh. Functional, yes, but also strangely beautiful. Like your cup is now wearing jewelry. Stapled cups turn up in antique shops to this day. They're not always priced highly, most collectors want perfect specimens, but to the trained eye, a well-stapled teacup says, someone cared enough to save this. Fringe tidbit. Some Edwardians deliberately used their most visibly repaired teacups when serving close friends. It was a way to say, you're one of us. You get the real tea and the real cups. There's even a documented instance of a hostess setting out a crackling tray, filled entirely with chipped or mended china. She called it her truth collection. Imagine sipping from a visibly fractured cup while discussing politics, parenting, or the state of your soul. It kind of fits, doesn't it? Now, for the quirky part, occasionally, teacup repairs weren't just physical, they were ritualistic. One letter from 1907 describes a woman in Cornwall who insisted on playing music while mending chipped cups. She believed harmony would restore the spirit of the porcelain. Whether or not it worked, her cupboard was full of fixed cups, and strangely, most of them did survive longer. Historians still argue whether these emotional attachments to broken china represented practical frugality or something more symbolic, an early, unconscious protest against the growing culture of disposability. One camp says, people just didn't want to waste money. Another says, these repairs told stories, and stories were currency. And you're starting to see why. Because once a cup has broken and been repaired, it carries new meaning. It's not just pretty, it's resilient. Scarred. Proven. One Edwardian woman wrote in her journal that she preferred her stapled cup to her newer ones. This one's earned its place, she said. It held grief and joy and kept doing its job. I should be so lucky. Your light joke for this round. A gentleman once tried to impress his future in-laws by helping in the kitchen after tea. He dropped a prized family teacup, panicked, and glued it back together with mustache wax and prayer. It lasted 3 days. He married the daughter anyway. She later wrote, "At least I knew what I was getting into." And now, an odd little phenomenon, invisible repairs. Some higher-income families took their cracked or chipped china to professionals who specialized in seamless mending, using early resin-like compounds to bond porcelain so perfectly that the flaw disappeared. But many Edwardian women disliked this. Why? Because to them, the scar was the point. It showed survival, continuity, and yes, maybe a little drama. Because what's a good teacup without a little story? Some even began decorating the cracks, filling them with gold paint or using colored waxes to highlight the damage, not hide it. You might know where this is going. Yes, it's strikingly similar to kintsugi, the Japanese art of golden joinery. Whether or not this parallel was consciously inspired or just a coincidental cultural echo, we don't know. But some scholars argue that Edwardian scar-celebrating repairs were their own kind of emotional craftsmanship. Not quite art, not quite necessity. Just a way of living with the brokenness. And doesn't that resonate? You think of all the things you've patched, haven't you? Friendships glued back together over time. Days stitched into routines. Hope mended quietly at night over a second cup of chamomile. Some Edwardian households even kept a mending drawer in the kitchen or drawing room, filled with old handles, surplus saucers, bits of broken porcelain that might one day fit something else. It was chaotic. It was beautiful. It was faith in future usefulness. One more fringe example. In one particularly bohemian London household, a group of women hosted fracture teas every spring. Guests had to bring a broken cup or dish and tell its story. Some cried. Some laughed. One guest brought only a saucer. "The cup didn't make it," she said, "but I'm still here." You smile at that. And maybe you reach for a cup now that isn't perfect. One with a little chip on the handle, or a faint hairline crack you pretend not to notice. But tonight, you see it differently. It's a survivor. It's yours. And here's your second light joke. A young girl in Sussex reportedly began naming her broken teacups. Not pets, heroes. Her favorite was Sir Cracksworth, a cup with 3 staples and a gold-painted rim. "He's seen some things," she'd whisper before every sip. Even the act of handling these repaired cups was different. Gentle. Respectful. And maybe a little reverent. Like the cup had passed through fire and come out the other side. Historians still argue whether this reverence stemmed from actual sentiment or the Edwardian obsession with continuity and order. But either way, it created a household culture where flaws didn't mean failure. They meant endurance. So maybe, by the end of this section, you understand something your cup has been trying to say all along. It's not less beautiful because it broke. It's more beautiful because it's still here. Just like you. You don't realize how quiet it's gotten until your ears notice the hush. Even the clink of your teaspoon feels louder than it should. Outside, maybe a breeze nudges the curtain. The world has grown smaller, softer, and yet here you are, stepping into the most unexpected of Edwardian tea spaces, the outdoors. That's right. Tonight, you're leaving the velvet-draped parlors and lace-covered tables behind. You're heading outside, onto manicured lawns, sun-dappled terraces, and occasionally, just occasionally, into a slightly damp patch of wildflowers and ants. Because for the Edwardians, tea didn't stay indoors. It migrated. Let's start with your mainstream historical fact. By the early 20th century, afternoon tea al fresco had become a cherished tradition among the upper and aspiring middle classes, particularly in warmer months. Gardens weren't just for walking, they were tea stages. And these weren't casual affairs. No thermoses and plastic cups here. No one crouching on a picnic blanket trying to find signal. Oh no. Edwardian garden teas were transported rituals, complete with wheeled trolleys, porcelain service, and folding chairs that creaked with elegance. Housemaids carried trays out to pergolas. Footmen unfolded tables under rose trellises. Hosts handed out fans and parasols like party favors. And somehow, someone always forgot the teaspoons. There's a wonderful quirk to this. Many families had a second tea set designated specifically for outdoor use. Usually older or slightly mismatched, it was affectionately referred to as the garden china. It wasn't quite good enough for the drawing room, but too loved to retire. A bit like your uncle's favorite gardening hat. Fringe tidbit. Some particularly fashion-conscious hostesses insisted on matching the teacups to the flower beds. Lavender china near the wisteria. Pale rose-pink cups beneath the arbor. One woman was so committed to this aesthetic that she painted tiny daisies on her saucers to speak to the cosmos. Historians assume she was not invited to every party. Still, there's something magical about tea in the open air. A warm breeze. Bees that get too curious. The faint crunch of gravel as a guest arrives, late but perfectly composed. It's a world where even the teacups seem to breathe a little deeper. And here's where it gets a bit wild. Because some Edwardian families, in an attempt to blend nature with ritual, went all in. One eccentric baron hosted forest teas on the edge of his estate, complete with moss-lined trays and acorns used as sugar holders. He claimed the experience made the tea earthier. His guests reportedly brought their own chairs after one too many beetle incidents. Now, your light joke. A clumsy but well-meaning nephew once brought the entire outdoor tea service out, but forgot to secure the tablecloth. One gust of wind, and the sugar bowl launched into the pond like a porcelain torpedo. The ducks were confused. The nephew was never trusted with linen again. But despite the hiccups, these outdoor teas served an important role. They blurred the line between formality and relaxation. You were still expected to behave, but you could smile more, laugh louder, and maybe even take off your gloves. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine loosening of social codes, or just a more palatable version of the same rules, just shaded by a vine. Some say outdoor tea allowed women to relax, at least slightly, away from the rigid drawing rooms. Others say it was simply performance, dressed in sun hats. But maybe both are true. Because outside, you saw people differently. The stern aunt with the perfectly starched collar suddenly looked almost soft under the sun. The stiff-lipped cousin actually laughed, when a butterfly landed on his saucer. The hostess smiled not because she had to, but because the roses were blooming just right. And you would have found your place on the edge of the lawn. Not too central. Just close enough to overhear gossip and pretend you weren't listening. Your cup would warm in your hand. The biscuit would be too crumbly. The breeze would smell like lilac and someone's perfume. Even the teacups themselves seemed to know. Many outdoor sets featured slightly thicker porcelain, designed to withstand a bump on a stone step or the occasional tumble into grass. Some even had heavier bases, yes, antitip technology, Edwardian style. Fringe example: one Scottish family had storm saucers, deep, bowl-like pieces with raised rims to stop spills during gusty weather. They weren't elegant, but they were legendary. One guest joked she could sail to Ireland in one if she added sugar cubes for ballast. Of course, not every garden tea went well. Rain was a common villain. So were ants. And once, a runaway spaniel leapt onto a tea trolley and cartwheeled a full set into a bed of dahlias. The hostess didn't speak for an hour. The dog got a biscuit anyway. Still, the idea persisted. Because outdoor tea wasn't about perfection, it was about possibility. It reminded Edwardians that tradition could stretch its legs, kick off its shoes, and touch grass. And this shift didn't stop at private gardens. Soon, public parks and seaside promenades began to host their own tea pavilions. Not quite aristocratic, more accessible. You could order tea at a booth, sit on a rented bench, and pretend the pigeons were butlers. The cups weren't porcelain, but they were real. You were still part of the ritual, just in a different key. Historians still debate whether these public tea spots democratized the ritual or diluted it. Was the ceremony still sacred when you drank from an enamel mug next to a stranger in a straw hat? You sip now, maybe from your own chipped mug, and think, it kind of is. Because even in public, even surrounded by noise and sunlight and strangers, tea still pulls you inward. Still makes you pause. Still reminds you of all the quieter, slower, lovelier versions of life. So here you are, outside and inside at once. A breeze ruffles your sleeve. The grass presses cool against your shoes. And in your hands, the same teacup as before, but now it carries light. You're sitting very still now. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Because the further you drift into Edwardian tea life, the more you realize this isn't just about cups and saucers. It's about everything that happened between them. And tonight, you're slipping into something softer still, the etiquette of slowness. It might sound counterintuitive. Etiquette usually means rules: don't slurp, sit up straight, pinky in or pinky out depending on which old book you trust. But for Edwardian women, teacup etiquette wasn't only about manners. It was about timing, pacing, presence. A kind of socially sanctioned mindfulness, before mindfulness was a hashtag. Your mainstream historical fact. By the early 1900s, tea time rituals were being taught to girls as early as age 8, not just to prepare them for adulthood but to reinforce the cultural value of composure. Learning how to pour without rushing, how to pass a cup with just the right tilt. It was like ballet, but with breakables. Imagine a child, perched on the edge of a chair just a touch too big, being gently corrected for turning her saucer clockwise instead of counterclockwise. She blushes. She slows down. She tries again. The goal isn't perfection, it's stillness. Because tea, for the Edwardian hostess, wasn't just about the beverage. It was a chance to demonstrate control, poise, and subtlety. You weren't only pouring, you were performing calm. Now your fringe tidbit. There existed, among the upper classes, entire instruction booklets on the rhythm of tea service. One guide from 1903 outlined the 6 movements of grace, which included when to pause between sips, how long to let the silence settle before introducing a new topic, and how to sense when a guest had finished, not by their empty cup, but by the angle of their shoulders. Yes. Shoulder angle tea telepathy. You might be laughing quietly now, and you should. It's a lot. But it also tells you something important. In a world of rushing trains, exploding cities, and newfangled machines, Edwardian tea offered respite through ritual. Even the cups participated in this slowness. Remember those absurdly small demi-tasses from earlier sections? They weren't stingy, they were deliberate. A small cup demanded a slow pour, a slow sip, a longer conversation. It wasn't caffeine culture, it was connection culture. Light joke time. One Edwardian etiquette tutor reportedly scolded her student for refilling too eagerly. The poor girl replied, but the conversation was drying up. The tutor, scandalized, responded, then you must let it dry. Dignity is parched before it is drowned. Now, let's talk hands. There was a specific way to hold the cup, of course. Thumb and forefinger on the handle. Middle finger for support. But more than that, it was about still hands. No waving mid-story. No gesturing with a full cup, lest you baptize your neighbor. Hands were steady, like your emotions were supposed to be. And if your hands weren't, well, that was noted. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on slowness in tea service was a genuine cultural value or merely a code for social containment. Were women being taught tranquility or silence? Was poise empowerment or policing? The answer, as always, probably depends on who was holding the teacup. Because here's the subtext. For many Edwardian women, especially those outside the highest social tiers, tea time was a rare chance to control the pace. In a world where their days were ruled by others, children, husbands, employers, tea became their pause button. Their own small rebellion. A moment where they called the rhythm. There's something poignant in that, isn't there? One working-class woman wrote in her journal, I boil the kettle slow on purpose. I want it to take its time. Gives me 5 more minutes to breathe. And so slowness, in this setting, becomes a secret strength. You'd have fit in nicely, you know. You, with your carefully poured milk, your thoughtful sips, your decision not to gulp or rush. You're already doing it, even now. Moving gently through this story. Holding each detail like a fragile saucer. Listening for the tiny creaks of meaning. Another fringe example for you. In some country households, older women taught tea etiquette using songs. Rhymed mnemonics to pace each action. Lift the pot, let steam say hi. Pour not fast and not too shy. Offer first, then take your own. If you clink, you pour alone. It's silly. And perfect. And exactly the kind of thing that sticks in your head at midnight when you're trying to fall asleep. Even the placement of cups reflected time-conscious etiquette. Empty cups weren't left in the guest's hand, they were quietly lifted, refilled, or removed. You didn't ask, you observed. You read the silence. The angle of the spoon. The tension in someone's posture. It was less about efficiency, more about empathy. You begin to realize, the rules weren't always about control. Sometimes they were about care. Historians still debate whether the intricacies of Edwardian tea etiquette created a false sense of intimacy or preserved a real one. Was slowness just an illusion? Or did it give people the space to truly be with each other word by careful word? You sip your tea now, slowly. Not because you have to. Because you want to. You understand it differently. This isn't just a cup, it's a tempo. It says, stop scrolling. Stop refreshing. Just breathe. Because deep down, this etiquette of slowness, it was never really about teacups. It was about attention. To others. To yourself. To the moment. And perhaps that's why you're still here, even this many words in. Because some part of you craved this rhythm. This whisper-paced cadence. This tiny, delicate rebellion against rushing. So here's your second light joke. A young Edwardian lad, trying to impress a debutante, attempted the perfect tea pour, but was so slow and focused he forgot to tilt the pot. The result? A very dry cup. She married him anyway. She liked his patience. And maybe that's the secret charm of all this. It wasn't about doing it perfectly, it was about doing it attentively. So tonight, as your eyelids grow heavier and your breath slows to match the cadence of your thoughts, just remember, you are allowed to move slowly. To speak gently. To live deliberately. With grace, yes, but also with truth. Even if your cup's a little chipped, you're holding that cup again, figuratively or literally, doesn't matter much at this point. You know its weight now. You know its temperature. But tonight, in these final sips of Edwardian memory, you step into the place where all of it converges, the teacup as inheritance. Because tea wasn't just an activity, it became a legacy. Passed down, carried forward, woven into stories and china cabinets and family arguments about who got the good set. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1920s, it was common for teacups to be included in wills. Yes. While land and jewels were split among heirs, many women carefully specified which granddaughter received which cup. Not the whole set, mind you, just one special cup. The one with the lilac pattern. The one she drank from every Thursday afternoon. The one she dropped in the garden once and never quite trusted again. Because in these cups lived more than tea. They carried memory. And memory has edges, doesn't it? That cup might be the only thing left from your great-great-aunt Edith. And she wasn't famous or scandalous. She was just someone who made exquisite scones and once shooed a goose out of the parlor with a broom and a firm voice. But when you pick up her cup, the one with the hairline crack and the slightly worn gold rim, you can almost hear her hum that off-key tune again. You can almost smell lemon curd. And suddenly the past isn't back there anymore. It's right here. In your hands. Your quirky fringe tidbit. Some Edwardian families started what they called cup trees. Picture a wooden stand, like a jewelry rack, each branch holding a different teacup, each one labeled with a name and date. Instead of a family tree on paper, this was one made of porcelain. Aunt Agatha, 1874. Cousin Basil, 1890. And at the top, the mystery cup. No one quite remembered who it belonged to, but it stayed, because that's what we do with legacy. You might laugh at how sentimental it sounds. But think about it. We still do this today. We hold on to our grandmother's teacup. We wrap it in bubble wrap like it's crown jewels. We move it from apartment to apartment, knowing full well we'll never use it, but also knowing we can't not have it. And yet, there's always someone who doesn't get it. Every generation has the cousin who tries to sell the old china on eBay. The one who says, it's just a cup. But for you. You know better. You know it isn't just a cup. It's an archive with a handle. Light joke time. A family dispute once broke out over a particularly delicate cup with violets on the side. Two sisters claimed it. Their mother solved the issue by flipping a coin and drinking from it right after. Now it's mine again, she said. You'll inherit it later. Maybe. But here's the deeper thread. Teacups carried invisible stories. They were silent witnesses to first loves and bitter quarrels, to miscarriages whispered over sips of strong Darjeeling, to victories toasted with a clink. They saw joy and grief, sometimes in the same sitting. The mark on the rim, from a ring she stopped wearing after he passed. The faded flower, rubbed by decades of absent-minded thumbs. Historians still argue whether this emotional attachment to objects has any academic merit. Some dismiss it as anecdotal nostalgia. Others argue that material culture, especially in domestic spaces, is just as valid as written record. But you already know. You feel it in your bones. Because these cups didn't just reflect history. They held it. Cup by cup. Pour by pour. Even museums now take this seriously. Many preserve orphaned cups, solitary pieces from broken sets, each tagged not just with origin but context. A label might read, owned by Mrs. M.L. Green. Used during suffragette meetings in Derbyshire. Not just porcelain. A witness to revolution. And as you sip your way through this final chapter, you're probably wondering, what teacup will you leave behind? Will it be the one you use every morning, chipped from too many hurried rinses? The one with the goofy slogan you pretend not to like but secretly adore? Or maybe, just maybe, it'll be the one you bought at that flea market on a whim. The one with the blue pansies. The one you didn't think mattered until it did. Because someone, someday, might lift it gently from a shelf. Wonder who you were. Imagine your hands. Picture your mornings. And they'll be right. Because legacy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's porcelain thin. Quiet. Patient. Waiting to be remembered. So here's your last light joke. A grandmother once wrote in her will, "To my eldest, I leave the Spode teacup. To my second-born, the Royal Doulton. To my youngest, who once said tea was boring, I leave nothing but the tea bag I used this morning." Frame it. Don't worry, they made up eventually. But the truth of it is, your cup matters. Because in holding it, someone will hold a piece of you. And that's a kind of immortality you don't have to earn. You just have to live. And maybe drink a lot of tea. It's quiet now. Slower. Even your thoughts move with less urgency. The images from tonight, the gloves, the garden, the hairline crack in porcelain, they linger, soft and weightless, like steam. Your breath is the kettle now. Rising, falling, gentle, predictable. The world around you fades into shadowed corners and the steady hush of everything being just as it should be. The clink of a teaspoon drifts far away, like a memory you don't need to chase. The teacup cools in your hand. Or maybe it's already been set down, safely. Either way, you're at rest. And in that stillness, something remains. The curve of a saucer. The glint of gold. The stories held quietly in cups passed from one tired hand to another. You don't need to remember everything. You've carried enough. Let the teacups stack neatly in your mind now. No dust. No hurry. Just waiting. And as the last images dissolve into the soft hush of your room, let your body follow. Head heavy. Shoulders loose. Breath slow. You are exactly where you need to be. Sleep well.